Webhooks. You've probably copy-pasted a few of them when building on N8N or other automation platforms without understanding what's really happening. I'm going to walk you through how they work so that by the end you can use them, understand them, and fix them when they fail. And I'll start with a very simple analogy, walk you through my TTA formula for how they work, and then tell you why it matters when building for businesses. So what is a webhook even, and how do they actually work? Picture a neighborhood, and every app on the internet is a house in that neighborhood. So WordPress is a house, Airtable is a house, your client's software is a house, and every house has like an address because that's the only way that anyone can ever find it. This is called the webhook URL. Now, a family, which represents a business, owns a couple of houses and they need to talk to each other, but there's no internet, no phones, no pigeons, nothing. There's just a postman who delivers letters at instant speed. So what do? They write each other letters. One house writes it, then they post it, and it shows up at the door of the other house. That's basically like a simple analogy of how webhooks work. Apps can communicate with each other by posting letters using HTTP, which is basically the internet's postal service. And in those letters can be data, instructions, or even requests for tasks to be completed. Now, WordPress, N8N, Make, and many other apps all come with an address book that's got the popular houses already saved in it so that you don't have to find the addresses of your favorite apps manually. So Airtable's there, Gmail's in there, Google Sheets is there. You basically pick one and it just works. I actually built a WhatsApp chatbot for a vet clinic, and every booking had to be landed into the Airtable account. But this was before I even understood how webhooks actually worked. But I still managed to get it to work just because they had already pre-built an integration for me. Some kind soul at WordPress had basically already saved Airtable's address into WordPress for me, and they had created like a custom integration that allows me to send data from my WordPress AI chatbot, basically where the business was hosting conversations with their leads, into Airtable. And by the way, platforms like WordPress, N8N, Make.com, they do this really well. They basically create a bunch of integrations for you to many other softwares. But sometimes a business runs on software that isn't in that address book, like it doesn't have a pre-created integration. It's basically custom and it's built specifically for their business, and no one has ever actually made a connection to it in Make or N8N or one of those apps that you're using. But we still have to hook it up to what we're building, and I call that situation an integration ceiling. It's when you reach a point where the pre-built integrations in a software aren't enough to cater for a business needs, and it's when webhooks actually become super important. And in fact, I'm actually sitting at that point right now. I'm building a student tracking app for a school to track attendance, performance, etc. And the plan was to add a WhatsApp bot so parents could check how their kid is doing. It's not live yet, by the way. I'm still waiting on some verification from the school, but I've already shown them the demo. I just wanted to be upfront with you about that. But the thing is, there was no pre-built integration in WordPress to this app because I custom built this app using Claude code. So the plan essentially becomes to use webhooks, and to use webhooks to connect that app to WordPress. You see, it's in instances like those that webhooks become really important. But there's a mistake that builders make with the URL of webhooks. This is basically the house address that allows the postman to understand where to deliver your letter. Let's start by thinking about it with the letters. You know, a letter goes to a specific destination, so the address has to belong to whoever's actually receiving it. If you want N8N to receive something, N8N hands you its address first, and then you copy that address and you paste it into the sending app. And by the way, you can usually find your webhook URL, your address that you're sending the data to, inside the receiving software that you want to use. If you can't, just ask Gemini how to find it. If the software was custom built, you can talk to the developers to hand it to you, or maybe even create it yourself if you understand what you're doing. Anyways, that receiving address has two parts. It's like a street and a house number. The first bit is the base. It's called the base URL, and it's something like webhook.wordpress.cloud. That's basically the street. And then there's a slash and a long string of characters after it, and that's which house on the street the data is being sent to. So in this case, that would be your exact chatbot in WordPress. So the same street can basically hold like thousands of houses essentially. That's why WordPress's base URL can be the base URL for many other users on WordPress, but every single user with an AI chatbot, in fact, every single AI chatbot will have a single unique URL that comes after the base URL to basically refer to that specific AI chatbot. And it's the same with other software, except instead of chatbots, it's databases, maybe sheets, maybe projects, etc. And so that specific address is basically where the data is sent to. It's the receiving address. And so that's how webhooks work, but there's also a second way that houses can talk. And I'll mention it very quickly so that you don't mix the two up. Basically, in this fictitious city, you can walk over to another house, knock, and ask for something. That's an API call or a GET request, and you're essentially going to another software, knocking, asking, and then waiting for an answer. Webhooks are the opposite. No one asks, you just get letters sent to other software. So it's like sending letters from house to house, but with API calls, GET requests, you essentially go over to a house, knock, and then get the information that you want. I hope the analogy is starting to make sense for you. But one more thing before we move on, most houses won't accept a letter from a total stranger. They want to know that it came from someone who's allowed to send it, from another member of their group of houses. So you usually attach a key, a password of sorts that goes along with the letter. And by the way, every platform kind of handles this in a slightly different way, and that's kind of a whole video on its own. But your letters will get turned away at the door if they don't have the right password, and if that's happening to you, that's probably why. So to send webhooks properly, you just need to work out which house is supposed to receive the data, take its address, put it in the right place of the sender, put the key, if one is needed, the password, and once you get that right, the rest is mostly just filling in the blanks. What's left is what goes in the actual letter, and I'm going to talk about that in just a bit. Alright, now we come to the TTA formula. Just so that you understand what webhooks actually do and the steps that they do them in, I'm going to share with you my TTA formula. Every webhook you'll ever build on any platforms follows the exact same 3 steps in this formula, but tutorials will never actually name them, which is why like every new setup feels like you're starting from scratch again, when really it's the same concept. I just gave it a name, and you can now use this whenever you're building webhooks and even fixing webhooks. So TTA, trigger, transfer, act. Something happens, data moves, something happens back. First, let's talk about the trigger. You see, letters don't write themselves in the sending house, in the starting software. Something has to happen first inside that house, that software, to trigger a letter to be wrote to another house. And on that school app that I've just been talking about, the trigger would be a new event getting added to the school calendar, but it could be anything else, like a new parent signing up, someone pays, maybe a form gets filled in. Whatever you need the trigger to be inside your sending software, you can set it up so that when that trigger goes off, it essentially writes the letter. The only part you have to remember is that the trigger always lives in the sending house, the sending software, never in the receiving one. And that's why when nothing at all shows up, it usually means that your trigger just never fired at all. And the thing that you wanted to happen in the sending house just never happened. And as a result, if the thing that you want to happen never happens, the sending house never even gets to writing the letter. It's like the whole scheme, the whole automation does not even start. But let's move to the second T in TTA, transfer. Let's say that the trigger actually goes through, it goes off, and now it's time for the letter to get written and actually posted. That's what happens in the transfer section. That letter is written in a format called JSON, and that stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's basically, the easiest way to explain it is it's like a crate full of like labeled boxes. One box labeled name, one box labeled customer phone number, one box labeled amount. These are just examples, by the way. It's basically just a label and then what's inside the label. And then the crate has like multiple of those combinations inside. And so the crate is the actual package being delivered, and the labeled boxes are called properties, each of them holding a piece of data that is trying to be sent into the receiving software. And by the way, every app on the internet has agreed to read this exact format, and that's the whole reason why any 2 apps can talk to each other at all. It all travels over something called HTTP, which is really just the postal system the entire internet runs on. Going back to that vet clinic example I built for a second ago, the letter going into their Airtable carried the customer's name, their phone, their email, the service they wanted, how many dogs they had, the ages of those dogs, and whether it was like an emergency. So it was basically a crate full of boxes with that information. One box would be called name, another called phone, another emergency status, etc. And that crate is now called a payload when we're transferring it using a webhook. It's what actually gets sent to the receiving software. Alright, so let's talk about the last part of the TTA formula, which is action. When the letter arrives, the receiving house opens it, reads it, and then does something. It takes an action. This part is very important because if there's no action taken from receiving that data, the whole thing is just a waste of time. That action might be something like saving the details somewhere, sending a message, kicking off a whole new workflow, alerting an actual person, etc. There's so many things you can do once it has received the data, where basically a webhook URL in N8N receives data from a trigger that some other software or platform has sent, and then it uses it in some kind of workflow that is hosted on N8N. That way N8N can take an action based on a trigger that's happening in a different app. WordPress is also quite similar, and going back to the school build I just talked about, WordPress would actually read the letter that it has received and then send a parent a WhatsApp message about an upcoming event at the school based on what was sent out by the school software. So based on the information in the letter. And the really cool part about like a setup like this is the parent, the end user in this case, never actually sees like any of this. To them it just looks like it's all just one software that works. It's like WhatsApp just magically has direct access to their child's information in the software, the database, and that's the whole illusion essentially. Two apps that have no real connection to each other can behave like one product. That's why webhooks are so amazing. So that's the formula that every webhook follows. Something happens, a trigger, and then data is transferred essentially, and then an action happens in another platform. That's literally it. You just have to learn it once, and every platform stops looking different, because underneath all of these platforms, they're literally just doing the exact same thing. Trigger, transfer, act. But you also need to know where things can actually go wrong so that you can fix it when that happens. So where do things actually break in this formula? Well, your first webhook will probably take a couple of tries to get right, just being honest, and that's completely normal. It will break, but you're just learning. What most builders do at that point is they start changing random settings in their softwares like N8N, WordPress, whatever, until they kind of made it worse actually. You don't need to do that because you already have the tool to find the problem. That's the TTA formula, because it tells you exactly where you should look. There's only 3 places that a webhook can break, one for each letter. So trigger, transfer, act. If the trigger isn't working, nothing arrives in destination software at all, and it basically means that the letter was never written in the first place. So you have to go and check in that sending app. But if the transfer broke, it means something did arrive, but the labels aren't what were expected, or maybe the letter didn't actually read it because there was no key. If the act part broke, that's usually a problem in the destination software. The letter arrived perfectly fine, but the receiving app couldn't do anything with it because you probably didn't build the right workflow, or maybe the process of it taking an action from the data it has received is not exactly clear. And I've gotten a lot of errors with webhooks before, so let me give you an example. With the vet clinic build that I did, I spoke a little bit about this earlier. I kept getting errors along the way when trying to send customer data into Airtable. And here's the thing, I wasn't even like writing the webhook myself. I was using WordPress's built-in Airtable integration, the easy path, the one that's like supposed to just work things out, because they've essentially already set up the webhook for me, and that's what's inside the integration. But it still kept getting rejected over and over. So first I tested it to see if the trigger was firing, and clearly in WordPress it was. So I knew that that couldn't be the problem. But then I looked at the transfer and to see if the data was actually arriving into Airtable, and it wasn't. So that's where my error was. I built the letter with the wrong labels on the boxes, and Airtable was expecting specific field names. And what I was sending did not actually match those like field names. So when it saw the data incoming, it didn't accept it, and instead just threw the entire packet straight back out the window. And that's another thing you have to keep into consideration. Most softwares expect specific labels, basically specific formats for the data that they're receiving. And if the data isn't in those formats, then they will reject it. Anyways, that experience taught me something very valuable about building AI chatbots, agents, and software. I learned that even when someone else's integration does the work for you, just like the one WordPress had built for me for Airtable, transfer is where you can go wrong, so you have to check twice. I now do that on all my client builds, and I also test a bunch to make sure I catch all the errors before I actually deploy their project. Also, there's another way to catch those errors and like pinpoint them before they actually happen. But I'll be straight with you, I haven't tried this yet, like being honest, but I've just heard people talk about it. Basically, there are free sites like webhook.site that give you a temporary address, and you can point your sending app at that address instead of like a real webhook URL. Fire it once, and it lets you basically see what is arriving at that address. So you can see like the letter, the data, every label, every value, everything laid out, and that way you can know that the trigger and transfer work but you can essentially also know that the data that you're sending is in the correct format. Only problem with that is you can't actually test the action, the last part of the TTA framework, because that actually only happens in the real destination that your data is arriving in. And so as a result, that you don't really get to test that, but it's good for, I guess, testing the first parts, the trigger and the transfer. So TTA explains how webhooks work, and it also tells you where to look when they don't. But why does this all actually matter when building AI chatbots, agents, and software for real businesses? You see, almost every client already has software that they're using before you turn up, and most of it isn't sitting in anybody's integration list, because at least for most businesses that have been around for a while, they've had like custom built software for them. This means that builders who understand webhooks and can form these connections can essentially take jobs that others have to turn down because they're only used to connecting to platforms that are already pre-set up for them. Coming back to the school project I'm working on again, that AI chatbot needs to push messages out to parents about events, but the app, which is custom built, like I've said, has the news. WordPress, which is connected to WhatsApp, doesn't have the news. So essentially the app has to post a letter over to WordPress. WordPress reads it, and then the parent gets the WhatsApp message. Here's another kind of build I've done. Basically, I was a content creator on LinkedIn, and I had a huge issue with getting the latest content ideas about trending topics in AI, which I'm sure you know there's a lot of AI news that comes out every single day. But basically, I wanted to get a hold of that news and make posts about it without having to do a ton of research. So I set up a make.com automation that would essentially run every single morning, do the research for me, and turn those research points into like content ideas that it would then send to me on WhatsApp. But the way it would work is that after Make has synthesized that research and turned it into content ideas, it would then send a letter in form of a webhook to WordPress, and then WordPress would then be able to send that message to my actual account, so to my WhatsApp message, and just send a text that says, hey, here are the top 5 content ideas that you can post about today based on trending news. So that's a very good example of how I've used webhooks in some of my builds. And the amazing things about them is as long as both softwares are up, WhatsApp, WordPress, and then also, of course, make.com, the letters just keep coming in each and every single day. The messages just keep coming in, and everything is just absolutely smooth, as if it's all one unified platform. And by the way, I'll be honest with you about these platforms. N8N and Make, for example, these automation platforms, they hide most of this from you. And most days I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's actually a good thing, because they handle the addresses and the letters so that you can just essentially drag boxes and nodes around instead. That's why these platforms are so valuable. Of course, they do a lot more than that, of course, but fundamentally underneath, they just have a bunch of webhooks connected between a bunch of softwares and a bunch of also API calls connected between these softwares. So that when you're trying to pass on data or build automations, they've already built the underground piping for you, so that all you have to do is just drag around stuff inside their studios. But that only holds up when the client's software is on their list of like inbuilt integrations, basically their address book. So the moment a specific software, such as a custom one, isn't in their books, you have to set up the connections yourself using HTTP webhooks. But as long as you understand what webhooks do, then you can definitely say yes to clients who ask for connections to things that are custom. And that's the big difference between building like demos and building things that a business actually runs on and can actually be properly integrated into a business. But honestly, understanding webhooks is just one skill, one of the many skills I had to learn to be able to build AI chatbots for businesses. And I'll be honest, it's not the whole job. The other 80% of building AI automations is knowing how to build the workflow that the client actually needs, the workflow that like the letter is going to arrive to. Essentially learning how to build the right systems that can take the right actions for businesses to help them either save money or make more money. So actually what I did is I put together a full build, basically an example. It's a WhatsApp AI chatbot on N8N that helps businesses save money by automating their interaction with clients over WhatsApp. So yeah, you can watch that. It's start to finish. It takes probably about an hour. The video's on screen, and you'll basically get the whole workflow logic, everything that's inside it. And by the end, you'll be able to build AI chatbots like these for local businesses. And I promise you, the address stuff I've just been talking about will also make a lot more sense once you've got something real in front of you by watching this tutorial.